Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. First, we have an article on page number 1 which provides us an update on the ongoing border dispute between India and China. We had discussed a few days ago that talks between senior military commanders of both the countries had been scheduled in order to resolve the border crisis as per established protocols and agreements. These talks were held on the 6th of June, and during these negotiations, the Indian side has insisted that status quo as it existed in the month of April should be restored at all locations where the border standoff has erupted. Basically, India has demanded the Chinese to pull back their forces and equipment to the pre-standoff position as it existed in the month of April before the border standoff erupted in the first week of May. In response to these Indian demands, China has raised objection to India's border infrastructure development along the line of actual control. But to this Chinese objection, India has said that infrastructure development along the border areas would continue to go on in the territory that has been clearly established as Indian territory under previous agreements, because China has already developed border infrastructure on its side of the border. So India has said that its construction activities won't stop, and it wants China to honor the existing agreements and restore the status quo that existed in April. But even though these high-level talks at the level of senior military commanders has failed to resolve the crisis, it shows that talks at the military and diplomatic level are going on to resolve the border crisis in a peaceful manner as per established protocols and agreements. But sources in the Ministry of External Affairs and the Indian Army have indicated that unless and until a diplomatic solution or a political solution is found to the current crisis, troops on both the sides will continue to hold on to their current positions. So we can expect the standoff to get prolonged as it was seen during the Doklam incident of 2017. Now let's take up a column from page number 6 written by India's former Vice President Hamid Ansari. In this column, the writer examines the critical role of the littoral states of the Persian Gulf in the global economy and how turbulence and volatility in the region affects the global economy and as well as the Indian economy and India's energy security. But before we have this discussion, first let us understand the geography of the Persian Gulf region. See, the United Nations defines this body of water as the Persian Gulf, and the 8 countries that surround it are the littoral states of the Persian Gulf. This includes Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Oman. These 8 littoral states of the Persian Gulf play a critical role in the global economy because all of them are major producers of crude oil and natural gas. In fact, a majority of the global oil supplies passes through the Persian Gulf, enters the narrow Strait of Hormuz, which is a strategic choke point, and then opens up to the Gulf of Oman and further to the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. This region, which is so crucial to the global economy, has been affected by turbulence and volatility over the last few decades, and this lack of stability and collective security in the region affects the global economy and as well as the Indian economy and India's energy security. The writer says that the last time that the Persian Gulf was relatively stable and relatively peaceful was when it was under the British, when it was being administered by Indian civil servants. But over the last 70 to 80 years, various political, religious and ideological divides have ripped open the society, and along with this, the intra-regional conflicts amongst the members of the Persian Gulf and the interference of external powers has led to a lot of political instability, violence, conflicts and turbulence over the last few decades. See, as the British vacated the region after the Second World War, the power vacuum in the Persian Gulf was filled by the United States, which was the then predominant power. Over the decades, the foreign policy doctrines of Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, and other subsequent American presidents has always tried to establish American hegemony in the Persian Gulf. In fact, this policy of the United States continues even to this day. Then, apart from the United States, other extra-regional powers such as the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and then Russia following the collapse of the Soviet Union, then Israel and Turkey, and European powers, particularly the United Kingdom and France, have all tried to interfere in this region, leading to greater destabilization and conflicts. Then internally, various political, religious and ideological conflicts have divided the Persian Gulf, and these internal divides have always been exploited by the extra-regional powers, particularly by the United States, in order to establish its hegemony over the global oil markets. But however, since the 1970s, attempts have been made to build cooperation amongst the Persian Gulf members and promote collective security in order to reduce external interference and counter turbulence and destabilization in the region. But these attempts at building cooperative security have been derailed due to the political, religious and ideological divides, which primarily includes the divide between the Shias and the Sunnis, represented by the geopolitical conflict between the two major power blocks of the Persian Gulf, that is Saudi Arabia and Iran. So promoting cooperative and collective security in the Persian Gulf is primarily centered on cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But these attempts have been derailed not only due to external interference, but also due to internal divides such as the rise of a Ba'athist Iraq under Saddam Hussein, the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the conflict between Iran and Iraq, etc. External powers, particularly the United States, has tried to exert its influence by exploiting these internal divides. The writer says that if this turbulence and volatility has to be reduced, then there is a need for a platform which will promote cooperative security amongst the members, which seeks to achieve the following two objectives. The first objective should be to promote intra-regional cooperation amongst the littoral states of the Persian Gulf. And the second objective should be to reduce external interference. The writer says that any such cooperative security platform should assure the following rights to the Persian Gulf countries. This includes the freedom to exploit their hydrocarbon reserves and other natural resources, the freedom to export their resources, and the freedom to pursue trade and commercial shipping as per their respective national interests. But more importantly, such a cooperative security platform should help the countries of the Persian Gulf to resolve conflicts without the need for external interference from extra-regional powers. But the writer says that in the current geopolitical environment, establishing such a cooperative security platform may not be possible because the key regional grouping, that is the Gulf Cooperation Council, is currently aligned with the United States and they are jointly locked in a geopolitical conflict with Iran. See, the GCC, which is primarily led by Saudi Arabia, includes Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar and UAE. This grouping, representing the Sunni power bloc, has the blessings of the United States and they have a mutually beneficial arrangement. Sunni Saudi Arabia, which sees a Shia Iran as an existential threat, enjoys unconditional military support from the United States, and in return, the Saudi Arabia-led power bloc has allowed the US to interfere with the geopolitics of the region and thereby with the global oil supplies as well. This alignment between the Gulf Cooperation Council and the United States serves American interests as well because the US shares a hostile relationship with Iran. The United States has consistently opposed Iran's nuclear weapons program, and it has recently walked out of the Iran nuclear deal and imposed stringent economic sanctions against Iran, which is stifling its economy. The recent increase in tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran and the United States and Iran has threatened oil supplies that pass through the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, thereby having a major impact on the global economy. Even though Kuwait, Oman, Qatar and UAE have initiated a separate dialogue with Iran in order to stabilize the region, these efforts have failed as a result of other global developments. The spread of the COVID-19 pandemic in the region, the sudden fall in global oil prices, and the turmoil within the OPEC has reduced the relevance of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and it threatens to affect the stability in the region. The writer says that the declining power status of the United States and increasing tensions between US and Iran and the geopolitical and economic factors related to the pandemic have affected the stability of the region, and this creates an urgent need to promote cooperative and collective security in the region. Then as far as India's equation with the Persian Gulf is concerned, these 8 countries of the Persian Gulf and the strategic ports such as Bandar Abbas, Dubai, etc., they are located in the immediate neighborhood of India. So naturally, the geopolitical and geo-economic developments in this region is going to have a direct impact on the Indian economy. These developments also have an impact on India's energy security because the Gulf cooperation countries account for nearly 34% of India's crude oil imports. India shares a very close and cordial relationship with most of the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, and all the governments of the Persian Gulf generally have a friendly approach towards India. This close relationship is built on the fact that bilateral trade between India and the Persian Gulf accounts for nearly $121 billion. The region is also home to a large population of the Indian diaspora who contribute to the economy of these Persian Gulf countries and also send back remittances of around $49 billion back to India. There are close to 9 million Indian workers who reside and work in the Persian Gulf countries, and they not only contribute to these economies, but they also contribute to the Indian economy by sending back precious remittances, which is crucial to bridging India's current account deficit. Apart from this, countries of the Persian Gulf are also a crucial source of investment for India, particularly in its infrastructure sector, oil refineries and petrochemicals. In fact, the state-owned oil companies of Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi are looking to invest around $44 billion in one of India's largest oil refinery that is coming up at Ratnagiri in Maharashtra. Then Saudi Arabia's Aramco, which is one of the world's largest oil refiners, is looking to acquire a stake in the oil and petrochemical business of Reliance Industries. India not only shares such a close and cordial relationship with the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, but it also shares a similar relationship with Iran as well. But of late, India's ties with Iran have been affected to an extent due to geopolitical developments involving the US and Iran. The American sanctions against Iran has led the US government to exert pressure on India to cut off trading and business relations with Iran, and this has strained the relationship between India and Iran, leading to geopolitical and geo-economic consequences on India's national interests. But traditionally, India has always tried to balance its relationship with the Gulf cooperation countries and as well as with Iran. India has traditionally tried to stay away from the local and regional disputes, but this is increasingly becoming difficult due to the increase in tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran and as well as between the United States and Iran. So in this context, the writer says that if India has to ensure its economic and energy security, then it needs to promote dialogue and stability in the Persian Gulf, and it needs to extend support to the establishment of a cooperative security platform which can build collective security amongst the Persian Gulf countries. The writer hopes that such a platform can help stabilize relations between the Sunni powers and the Shia powers and reduce the external interference of extra-regional powers. Now let's take up another column from page number 6, in which the writers examine the role of India's private healthcare sector in tackling the COVID-19 pandemic. See, at the very outset, the writers make it clear that the COVID-19 pandemic is not going to disappear anytime soon, and the pandemic is here to stay with us at least for the coming few years. So considering this, in order to battle the pandemic, the country would require massive resources and investments in order to strengthen its healthcare infrastructure. So the writers say that the pandemic has presented an opportunity to bring in structural changes in the healthcare sector and rejuvenate private partnerships. See, as of now, India's fight against the COVID-19 pandemic has been largely led by the public healthcare sector, which has already been strained and overstretched. As the number of cases continue to increase exponentially, India will be required to mobilize massive amounts of resources and investments, and this can be done only by mobilizing private resources and by building more public-private partnerships. Since India is staring at the possibility of dealing with a few million cases in the coming months, the public healthcare sector alone won't be able to bear the load, and hence the government needs to come out with a clear-cut policy which can mobilize private healthcare resources and build partnerships between the public and private healthcare institutions. The writers point out that as of now, the role of the private sector in India's fight against the pandemic is not quite clear. The lack of a clear-cut policy and clear-cut guidelines has affected the other healthcare services being provided by the private healthcare sector, leading to a cash crunch. Upon this, the lack of clarity on the charges that private hospitals can impose for COVID-19 related services and the capping and regulation of these prices has further caused uncertainty, which has affected cash flow in the private healthcare sector leading to the locking up of private healthcare resources. So the writers say that the government needs to make use of the pandemic as an opportunity and utilize the 2.1 lakh crore package announced for the healthcare sector to unlock private healthcare resources and introduce structural changes which could rejuvenate the healthcare sector through private participation. The writers point out that there are 4 areas in particular where the private healthcare industry can augment the resources of the public healthcare sector. This includes testing, hospital infrastructure, the procurement and supply of biomedical equipment, and the establishment of a central intelligence system. See, as we all know, the key to tackling the pandemic is largely dependent on our ability to carry out mass testing. The only way through which the pandemic can be contained is by scaling up testing, and the ability of the public healthcare sector to scale up testing at the national level is quite limited due to the constraint on its resources. This is one of the key areas where the private healthcare industry can augment the resources of the public healthcare industry, and if clear-cut policy guidelines are brought in by the government, then the private healthcare sector can help in scaling up testing, especially in Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities. The next area where the private healthcare sector can supplement the resources of the public healthcare sector is with regard to hospital infrastructure. Because as the number of cases continue to grow, hospitalization would increase as well. The need for hospitalization would increase as well, especially in Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities. As of now, most of the hospital infrastructure is concentrated in the urban areas, and this challenge can be tackled by roping in the private healthcare sector to create the required hospital infrastructure in the Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities. The writers appreciate the central government for recently increasing the viability gap funding to 30%, which provides the much needed capital for private healthcare sector to ramp up hospitalization infrastructure. According to the writers, this funding can be used to hire the private sector to create ICUs in public hospitals, to provide skilled manpower such as doctors and healthcare professionals, and to provide treatment at fixed rates, which could help in reducing the burden on the public hospitals. Next, the private sector can play a key role in ramping up the procurement and supplies of biomedical equipment such as ventilators, test kits, etc. The government can offer incentives and buyback guarantees in order to promote private healthcare industries to manufacture, procure and supply essential biomedical equipment, which is very much necessary to augment the resources of the public healthcare sector. Then finally, the private sector, especially the IT companies that are involved in the healthcare sector, they can help the public authorities to create a central intelligence system that can help in identification of patients, carrying out contact tracing and tracking hospitalization through an artificial intelligence enabled IT system. So this is how a well-defined policy can make use of the pandemic as an opportunity to bring in structural changes in the healthcare sector and rope in the private sector to supplement the resources of the public healthcare sector. Now let's take up a column from page number 7. Just a couple of days ago, we had an elaborate discussion on the topic of man-animal conflict in the context of the tragic death of an elephant in Kerala. This column in today's newspaper takes this discussion further, and it highlights the debate between environment conservation, animal rights and farmer rights. See, as we discussed the other day, the elephant in Kerala most likely died by accidentally consuming an explosive laden fruit that was actually meant to eliminate other smaller animals such as wild boars or monkeys, which cause massive destruction of crops. See, such smaller animals which cause massive destruction of crops and affect the well-being of farmers, they can be declared as vermins under the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, and the government can authorize their culling and as well as their hunting in order to keep their numbers under check. See, when animals such as wild boars, when they explode in their numbers and when there is an infestation, they can destroy crops in the region, leading to significant losses which has to be borne by the farmer. Usually in developed countries, there are well-defined policies in place to deal with such threats, where the government can order these animals to be culled or hunted down by the local villagers themselves. It is true that the culling and hunting of vermins appears to be inhuman and goes against animal rights, but in the larger scheme of things, the elimination of vermins is actually a scientific way of promoting environment conservation and the protection of larger threatened species. Because see, if the smaller vermins are not eliminated through such policies, it could push the farmers and the local villagers to resort to illegal methods to keep such animals away, which might end up threatening the bigger threatened species of animals. In developing countries such as India, such provisions are rarely used because, in most cases, wildlife activists oppose the culling of vermins on humanitarian grounds and in the interests of animal rights. But what they fail to understand is that the failure to scientifically eliminate vermins could affect the larger interests of environment conservation and as well as the rights of the farmers. The writer further illustrates how the focus on animal rights and the opposition to eliminate vermins could affect the larger interests of environment conservation. He takes the example of wild boars and elephants that we have recently seen in Kerala, and he says that wild boars can be eliminated considering the destructive impact that they have on agricultural crops. He says that such elimination of wild boars will not affect the species because they have been listed as least concern on the IUCN Red List. Whereas failure to eliminate the wild boar might end up pushing the farmers and local villagers to take up illegal methods which could threaten larger animals and threatened species such as the elephants, which have been listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List. So the writer says that animal rights and humanitarian values should not come in the way of making a scientific choice which could actually lead to the conservation of the environment and as well as the promotion of farmers' welfare. The writer also says that villagers and farmers should not be made to unnecessarily bear the burden of increasing incidents of man-animal conflict because the compensation that they currently receive for the destruction of crops by vermins is already inadequate and the payments are delayed due to red tapeism in the bureaucracy. The inadequate compensation and the delay in payments might push the farmers and the villagers to take up illegal methods to kill the vermin, and this might end up threatening larger threatened species of animals as well. The writer also says that it is not just the villager or the farmer who is responsible for such environmental destruction. It is also the urban dweller who should share a larger part of the responsibility because at the end of the day, villagers and farmers are trying to meet the unsustainable demands of the urban dweller. So to overcome this environmental crisis, the writer suggests two solutions. One is to adopt a scientific approach towards the elimination of vermins that is devoid of the emotion of animal rights. Second is to focus on the regulation of agricultural and industrial activities in order to reduce habitat destruction. Because it is habitat destruction which is pushing the wild animals into closer contact with human beings. If you look at elephants in India, for example, only 25% of their range falls within protected areas such as wildlife sanctuaries and national parks. The rest of the range is not protected, and this exposes elephants to greater chances of man-animal conflict because their habitat is being destroyed through developmental activities. So in order to reduce the pressures of development on the habitat of wild animals, the writer suggests that the government should provide a subsidy to the farmers in order to encourage them to adopt more sustainable ways of farming, which doesn't threaten the natural habitat of the wild animals. And he also calls upon government institutions, such as the National Board for Wildlife, the Forest Advisory Committee, to make more responsible decisions while approving the diversion of forest land towards industrial activities. Now let's take up an article from page number 10, which helps us understand China's health diplomacy initiatives in South Asia, which is helping China to increase its influence in India's neighborhood by using the COVID-19 pandemic as an opportunity. According to the article, Nepal is expected to host a team of medical experts from the People's Liberation Army of China in order to help Nepal contain the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, China will also be sending a similar team of medical experts to Bangladesh as well, and it has already deployed a team of experts to Sri Lanka and Myanmar. So these diplomatic initiatives of China helps us understand how the country is trying to increase its influence in India's neighborhood by using the pandemic as an opportunity. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. In this particular state, most mineral-rich districts are tribal dominated. According to the 2011 census, its tribal population constitutes 9.1% of the country's tribal population, and 22.85% of the state's total population. With 62 tribal communities, it has the most diverse tribes in India. In terms of tribal population, it occupies the third position in India. Of India's total 75 PVTGs or particularly vulnerable tribal groups, 13 of them reside in this state. Santal, Puyan, Saunti, Ho, Juang, Karwar, Mahali, Oran Kola and Kora are some of the prominent tribes found in this state. This description refers to which state? The correct answer is option B, Odisha. See, the easiest way to answer this question is by knowing two important facts. One, Odisha has the highest number of PVTGs. Out of the total 75 particularly vulnerable tribal groups in the country, 13 of them are found in Odisha. And amongst the states that have the highest tribal population in the country, first we have Madhya Pradesh, followed by Maharashtra, and followed by Odisha at the third position. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 4, the Odisha government is planning to set up mega educational complexes that are dedicated for tribal students. These educational complexes will come up in the tribal dominated districts, which also happen to be the most mineral rich districts of the state. These educational institutions is meant only for tribal students, and it will focus on skill development, which includes both academic skills and sporting skills. Now let's take up the next practice question. Gene editing with the CRISPR-Cas9 system of today traces back its origin to the research work of which popular scientist? The correct answer is option C, Gobind Khorana. This question has been asked because the 50 years ago article on page number 7 makes a reference to the research work of Gobind Khorana. He became the first scientist to produce a synthetic gene for which he was even awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine. The article points out how this invention of Gobind Khorana could pave the way for gene editing and how the recent discovery of DNA and RNA combined with gene editing technology paves the way for both exciting and frightening possibilities with regard to gene editing. In fact, the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology of today traces back its origin to this research work of Gobind Khorana. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Federated Malay states, consisting of parts of modern-day Malaysia, was established by the French government. The federation, along with the other Malay states and colonial possessions of the peninsula, was overrun and occupied by the Germans during the Second World War. The labor employed in the rubber estates of the Federated Malay states was predominantly Indian. Amongst the given statements, the first and the second statements are incorrect. So the correct answer is option C, 3 only. See, the Federated Malay states in the Malay Peninsula was established by the British colonial government and not by the French government. And these federated states were overrun and occupied by the Japanese invading forces during the Second World War and not by the Germans. In this region of the Malay Peninsula, the British were cultivating rubber estates by largely employing Indian labor. This question has been asked because the 100 years ago article from page number 7 refers to the discrimination and racism faced by Indian laborers employed in the rubber estates of the British government in the Federated Malay states. Now let's take up the next practice question. India is sourcing specialized aircrafts for VVIPs such as the President, Vice President and the Prime Minister from Boeing, United States of America. Option A is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 9, the delivery of India's VVIP aircrafts from Boeing of United States has been delayed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? The National Gallery of Modern Art is a premier art gallery under the Ministry of Culture. It acts as the nerve center for performing arts such as theatre, dance and music. Amongst the given statements, the second statement is incorrect. So option A is the right answer. See, the NGMA is an art gallery for paintings, sculptures and photography and not for performing arts. So option A is the right answer. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 10 which refers to the online workshops that would be held by the National Gallery of Modern Art. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the below given statement is related to the Ambarnaya River? The correct answer is option B. It is located in the Siberian Peninsula of Russia and it was the site of a major oil spill that threatens the Arctic environment. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 14 which refers to the recent oil spill that occurred in Russia, which has resulted in the spillover of thousands of liters of oil into the Ambarnaya River that flows through the Siberian Peninsula. This river drains into the Arctic Ocean, and thereby the oil spill poses a threat to the Arctic environment. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2019 prelims paper. Consider the following statements. The Petroleum and Natural Gas Regulatory Board is the first regulatory body set up by the Government of India. One of the tasks of the PNGRB is to ensure competitive markets for gas. Appeals against the decisions of PNGRB go before the appellate tribunals for electricity. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is incorrect, so option B is the right answer. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: countries in the Persian Gulf littoral contribute critically to the global economy as they are major producers of crude oil and natural gas. But turbulence in the region has often disrupted the global economy. Examine the statement while briefly evaluating India's relations with the region. The second question: the COVID-19 pandemic is a chance to bring in structural changes in the health sector and rejuvenate private partnerships. Discuss. So kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. This concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.